think we're almost ready. Hold on a moment. All systems are running. We are live. All right, awesome. Good morning, everyone. Hope you are doing well. You're safe and warm and ready for another coffee talk. So last week, we started a very important conversation about, well, how do we as Jews understand our faith? Is it just something we're meant to believe? Or these ideas that we just accept as faith, and therefore there's no room to question it? Or is there some sort of a scientific, factual way of relating to our beliefs? Now, Judaism asks us to know that there is a God, to know that the Torah is true. And what we went through last week was we spoke about the idea of national revelation, and how national revelation was something that uniquely made Judaism stand apart from every other religion. Additionally, we spoke about the two prophecies that were made in the Torah itself, that there will be no people to ever make the claim of national revelation. There'll be no people to make the claim that you had all these eyewitnesses who recognized that the Torah was, that God had come down and given the Torah itself. So what I want to do today is I want to touch on the idea I spoke on last week about history versus legend. How do we know what is historical versus what is legend? All right. If someone says to you, like, come on, like all you guys, Jews, you believe in things that are very nice. These are nice ideas, but really it never really happened. These are just legends. And how do we differentiate for ourselves? Like, is there an approach? How can I know what is historically true versus what is just a story or a legend? May be true, may not be true, but I'm not really sure. So all accounts, historical accounts, can be divided into two different categories: history and legend. Now, history refers to the events that we feel certain that they occurred. Okay, these things are usually based on solid evidence. Legends, on the other hand, are stories which may or may not be accepted as true. We don't have any evidence to corroborate whether or not they're true or not. But the question is, again, how do we distinguish between these two? So let's go through two different accounts. You are familiar with the George Washington's cherry tree story? Well, if you're not, get ready. Okay, so every American, virtually every American, maybe not everyone here, heard of the story of George Washington and his cherry tree. He was a little boy, and he chopped down his father's cherry tree. And his father was naturally upset and started asking questions. Hey, George, what happened to my tree? So George apparently said that, I cannot tell a lie. It was I that chopped down the cherry tree. Now, we don't know if that story actually happened, but millions of Americans love telling the story of George Washington's, veracity. But do we know if it really happened? Right? If only a tiny number of people believe that it actually happened, what is the explanation? How do we explain this? How do we know whether or not this story is real or if it's a legend? Oh, we got someone saying, I've been to his home in the DC area, quite beautiful. Long. Okay. Yes, but how do we know the story, if whether or not the story is true or not? Okay. So, okay, now let's talk about the Black Death for a minute. Since we're in the middle of a plague, let's talk about another one that happened in the 14th century. Like, why not? So, in the 14th century, you have a terrible calamity which was estimated to have caused millions of deaths in Europe hundreds of years ago. Now, how many people today regard that occurrence, the Black Death, a true occurrence? What is the distinction between the Black Death plague in the 14th century and George Washington's cherry tree in the 17th century? How do we know the difference between one and the other? They're both, we talk about them in history class, but what's the difference between the two? How do we distinguish between these two different stories? So good. So Izzy's saying the man of witnesses. Okay, that's the right answer. So it has to do with the number of eyewitnesses, not just witnesses, right? People who were participants that actually saw what happened. Now, even if the cherry tree story had actually happened, how many people actually saw it happen? How many people were there? Right? One, right? Because just based on George Washington's personal account. But there was no one there to testify if it happened. But on the other hand, the Black Plague, which, an event that impacted millions and millions of individuals that were alive, that saw it, they knew exactly what was going on. So based on this idea, okay, these are two basic principles. Number one, if a huge numbers are claimed to have witnessed an event, and a huge number of their own descendants afterwards accepted this claim as true, right? Like in the case of the Black Death, then this claim is reliable as historical fact. Historical fact. So it's huge numbers of people that actually saw it, and their descendants also accepted that the claim as being true. That is historical fact. If, however, the numbers of claimed participants or eyewitnesses were small, right? They were tiny. Then even if a huge number of people came to accept this claim true afterwards, this claim will always be probably characterized as legend, like in the case of the cherry tree. Okay, there's a big distinction over there. So let's do this. It's important to point out that the distinction between history and legend is in no way meant to imply that only claims which fall into historical category should be considered as true. It's obvious that in every time and place, the number of events which actually involved huge numbers of people have been a fraction of the percent of the total number of true cases. Someone's posting something in there. The history news, top George Washington. Okay, fine. I'm not sure what Roman. What does it say in there in a nutshell? It didn't happen. Okay, we'll find out in a moment. So the point is that both at the event itself, as well as in terms of his acceptance afterwards, the validity of a claim is very much dependent on those rare cases which are actually huge in numbers. In all other cases with no claim of huge numbers, okay, we will either have to rely on some other mechanism of establishing as true, or more likely we'll have to conclude that it's simply, there's no means of proving it, and therefore maybe it's a legend, maybe it's true, maybe it's not true. It's also important to appreciate why numbers, especially large numbers, have such an effective means of establishing historical certainty. Now, it's true that on a very simple and intuitively obvious principle in human psychology, the masses of people will often accept as true some claim, which they have no evidence for either way. This is definitely something that we're struggling with today, people accepting all kinds of conspiracy theories, but they're never going to accept a claim which they know for certain to be false. That's why these conspiracy theories are so plausible, is because there's enough evidence that would suggest that they may be true. So this rule is very relevant with history and claimed events, because it's obvious that the questions of occurrences, such as a black or white one, either a particular event happened or it did not happen, when it comes, on the other hand, to ideology and propaganda, which most people almost never view in black and white terms, that principle does not apply. And of course, there have certainly been no shortage of examples of huge numbers of people accepting all types of false ideologies in societies. Now, if we apply this principle to history, right, we'll see why the number of claimed participants or eyewitnesses to an event are so significant. Now, if a particular event is claimed to have occurred to only a tiny number of people and contains no evidence, no additional evidence of any kind, there's no archaeological proof, there's no written corroboration, there's no cave paintings, there's nothing, and then it's accepted afterwards, right? Its acceptance afterwards will clearly have nothing to do with evidence at all. Its acceptance or rejection will then be a function of other factors, such as political, nationalistic, religious, personal preference. Now, a particular historical event is claimed to have occurred to large masses, if someone comes along and says, yes, this happened, okay, um, then the situation for later generations are going to become very crystal clear, right? So either the event will have been widely known and spoken about, okay, in which case it would be absurd to deny it, or it will never have been heard of, in which case it would be equally absurd to believe in it. So super clear over here, with small numbers and no expectation of the event being widely known. There's no witnesses, so it's obviously irrelevant. So the principle of large numbers of claimed eyewitnesses and participants accepted afterwards by similar huge numbers, that is where you have a reliable story. It's ironclad. Think about it for a moment. To deny it would require believing that a huge mass of people accepted this claim as true, which they certainly knew as being false, right? Now, let's leave Judaism and Torah aside for a moment. Throughout all of the thousands of years of world history, there has never been a single exception to this rule. Never. Right? Therefore, every single instance in which a historical claim has a huge numbers at its basis, so we're talking about both the original event and then afterwards, because it's not enough just to have the original event. It's this, the next generation is actually talking about it, that, oh, my parents said this, and kind of like us, like we think about the Holocaust deniers. So we've all met Holocaust survivors, right? So the Holocaust survivors are the people that were the eyewitnesses. We had millions of people that escaped and witnessed the horrors of the Holocaust. And then we, the descendants, hear the stories of these people saying, hey, this happened. And by the way, here's my tattoo. Here's my scar. Here's my that, right? That's very, very powerful, very hard to deny that. But that is an example of of an event that is a reliable historical fact. And there's never been a single instance of a historical claim with huge numbers which any reliable historian ever denied. So think about that for a moment. I'm telling you, my friends, that the Torah has a historical evidence built into the system itself, that there's mass number of people that experienced the Exodus. There's a mass number of people who have a story that's being told from generation to generation that ensures that what we believe isn't just some legend that took place to one person so long ago. And definitely, if you're listening to this class for the first time, I recommend going back and hearing the previous conversation that we had, because this next part is a continuation of that. So let's go back to our original question concerning Moses' two prophecies, right? Are those two prophecies and their uniqueness of national revelation at Mount Sinai? So we believe that it's impressive for the Torah to tell us throughout history there will never be another national revelation event ever. And I would say it's even far more remarkable that the Torah can prophesize that there will never be another national revelation claim. It's one thing to have the claim and to say it'll never happen again. It's a whole other thing, right? Because it's impossible or very difficult for some group or person to fabricate an actual event involving large numbers of people. A claim, right, that can happen, but it'll be very easily disputed. Okay, and when the claim of such an event would be relatively easy to go ahead and make, but this is directly contradicted by what we said above, right? So if huge numbers are claimed to have experienced an event, and huge numbers of their own descendants afterwards accepted this claim as true, then this claim is reliable historical fact. Okay, but now, contrary to popular belief, you can't just say whatever you want and be guaranteed some believers. Okay, so if like we pointed out, everything depends upon the numbers claimed. If we fabricate a claim of huge numbers that would be they have such an enormous expectation of widespread awareness to overcome that no group would ever be naive enough to accept it. And therefore, no one would ever be foolish enough to attempt it. When that with small numbers and no expectation, since there would be nothing stopping, any group from accepting such fabrication, there would simply be nothing stopping anyone from attempting to make this false claim. So now it's clear, both from logic and as well as historical precedent, that it would be an absolute impossibility to fabricate national history. Now, the Torah prophesies that no other nation will ever have a national revelation event, then any human being could make a second prediction of no national revelation. Now, you don't need to be a prophet to know that no nation will ever consciously accept a lie and then teach that lie to their own children. Therefore, it is specifically the first two of these prophecies and no other national revelation event which is more impressive. The second one, or the no other national revelation claim, is just logic. Okay, so let's explain. In order to appreciate this, let's go directly to the central question of the entire argument. Did the Torah originate from a human being or from God? That's what we got to just figure out, whether or not, is this something that a bunch of guys wrote in a cave, or is this coming from a divine source? Now, if people fabricated the Torah, then this means the revelation of Mount Sinai never happened, and it's somehow possible to invent national history. We could invent it. The whole thing's fake. Now, aside from the obvious difficulty of believing this in terms of all that we discussed up until now, the prophecies of uniqueness raises two questions. Number one, if a human author was himself so successful at fabricating national history, why would he prophesize that no one else would ever attempt it? And additionally, what then? What would then explain the incredible uniqueness of the Sinai claim that no one else ever attempted to do what the Torah's authors are supposed to have done so successfully? Meaning, if it really is fake, then how come we don't have 5 or 6 other historical national revelation stories that take place? Why didn't the Christians and the Muslims make the same claim? Think about it. This conversation requires like a tremendous amount of intellectual effort, right? Think about what I'm saying just right now. If this whole thing is so sketchable that anyone could make it up, then how come no one else has made it? And if the Torah's author was in fact false, he was a fake guy who just lied about the whole thing and he got away with it, how come other people couldn't get away with it? Right? Now, however, if the words of the Torah came from a higher being, I call him God, I call him Hashem, then that would mean that the revelation of Mount Sinai did happen. And there's no reason to believe that the national history can be falsified, right? Then we'd have no difficulties whatsoever, aside from there being no conflict with anything stated previously, that the prophecies would be perfectly understandable. But since God can obviously decide never to appear before any other nation again, there's no difficulty in him declaring in the Torah that this is never going to happen again. And since it's impossible for a claim of this magnitude to be fabricated, there is no problem in understanding how the Torah could predict that no other group or nation would ever claim what the Torah claims. I'm not sure if you guys appreciate what I just did over there, but that was like mind-blowing. Like, hello, like you realize that like if you go through the argument, right, it's a powerful claim that what we as Jews have been doing is true. Okay. So let's summarize. Let's just try to make this a bit more palatable. The absolute uniqueness of both events, as well as the claim of national revelation, in both fact as well as prophecy, is either an insurmountable difficulty if one believes that the author of the Torah was a human being and Sinai never occurred, which means if you don't believe there's a God that did this, why are you doing this? It's crazy. And there's no difficulty whatsoever if one believes that the author of the Torah was God, and he did in fact speak to the entire Jewish people at Mount Sinai. Now, I think, when we talk about belief, it's important to remember that Judaism today is fractured, Rabbi. Like, what are you talking about? Like, talk about belief. You have so many Jews today that don't believe. There are so many Jews throughout history that, kind of lost their Judaism. In America, this is a crazy number. Ready? There were Jews coming to America since the mid 1500s. Spanish, Portuguese Jews were coming to this country in large numbers. One of the first Jewish communities that were set into this country, as far as like community-wise, started in the early 1600s. The Spanish-Portuguese synagogue on the Upper West Side started all the way on the Lower East Side and moved several times before they got to the Upper West Side. That is the Spanish-Portuguese community. The oldest synagogue in the world that still exists is in Rhode Island. Actually, if you ever go, they have a very cool feature in their Bet Knesset. They have a secret passageway under the bima, that if, God forbid, they were ever thrown into the synagogue, and then, like, which happened very often in Europe, where they'd throw all the Jews in the town of the synagogue and then light it on fire and burn everyone in the synagogue. They had a secret passageway that took you 2 blocks away from the synagogue, underground, built into the synagogue. Like, these people were ready for synagogues, but they were still afraid. They had a backup plan. We don't think like that anymore. We're too comfortable here. But if you actually think of the numbers, with so many Jews coming to this country from the 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, right? The number of Jews that should be living in America today. Okay, today there's about 5 million Jews in America, but in reality, we should have close to 30 million Jews in America today. That means all of those other Jews assimilated and are lost. That's mind-blowing. 30 million. We could assume that there's about 14 million Jews today on planet Earth, the whole planet. Just in America alone, if each one of those families would have just had 2 kids, okay, just to replace themselves, we should have had close to 30 million Jews in this country, which we don't. Some people in my circles call what's going on in America the silent Holocaust. Today, the assimilation rate is close to 50%, if not more, in America, which means that if we just take those numbers alone, in 30 years from now, less than one generation away, the population of the Jewish community in America will be subtracted by 50%, which means we'll move from 5 million Jews to 2.5 million Jews in one generation. That's a terrifying number. We've never seen that before. It's in other places around the world. It's worse. I was 2 winters ago, I was in Moscow and in Ukraine and in St. Petersburg. St. Petersburg is a gorgeous city. There's about 90,000 Jews in St. Petersburg today. The assimilation rate in St. Petersburg is 95%. 95%. In Europe, it's 72%. That's terrifying, terrifying. And it's all because of one thing. It has to do with a lack of appreciation of the depth of their belief. It's just a religion. It's irrelevant. There's no way of really getting yourself to a place of being comfortable scientifically, logically, in believing your Torah and believing in God. The West has accepted a philosophy that I think is super destructive. I don't believe that the West has figured out families and relationships and child rearing and how to build society, because we're seeing it fall apart. Divorce rates in this country right now are higher than ever. I have friends who are lawyers, who are divorce lawyers. They're booked for the next 4 months. You can't get a divorce lawyer today because people just want to get out of their relationships. If we have all this wisdom and knowledge in the West, that the systems, the society we've created is so brilliant with everything they know, all the history we've learned, all the psychology, all the history, all the science, then why haven't we created a nation that is healthy and growing and thriving? Something's broken here. And I really believe, that, and this is my segue into Purim for a very brief moment, is that if you think about what the Purim story is, the Purim story was a suicide mission by the Jews. You're going to get up and you're going to fight against the Greek army. You're a bunch of Kohanim. You guys were like the nerds who sat there and were like, teaching people, and you're bringing your sacrifices. You're going to battle against the most powerful army on planet Earth These guys are like six-packed, chiseled with their spears. They were taught to fight in unison. They understand the art of war, and you're just a bunch of priests. You're going to go to war. What were they thinking? And this is like the lesson. And I think it's very relevant to us in our time today. The lesson is this. When the Greeks realized the Jews were not going to assimilate, that they were still maintaining their identity, they were not buying into Hellenism as a system, they imposed all kinds of rules to prevent Jews from maintaining their identity. And that was, number one, no Shabbat. Number two, no mikvah. Number three, no circumcision. Number four, no limud haTorah. Those are the main issues. Okay, now what was their issue with circumcision? Like, what's such a big deal? Why was Brit Milah an affront to the Greeks? Okay, ready? The Greeks believed in the world of externalities, that beauty is external. And if you are a beautiful person, then you should have the highest seat in society, because what they valued was called chitzoniyut, external materialism. Okay, if a baby was born with a little deformity, it was totally acceptable in Greek society to take that baby and leave it out in the forest to die of exposure. Or the custom by many Greeks was to take the baby by its left leg and slam it against a rock and killing it. That was the world that they came from. That was the West. Okay, the Enlightenment of Hellenism that they brought to the world. We rejected those principles, but not just because we thought they were absolutely crazy. It's because they were lying to us into believing that the world is measured by external things. Okay. As a Jew, we believe in the pnimiyut of life, the inner world that can't be measured, that can't be defined. And therefore, if we think of circumcision, there's a famous story that is told in the Talmud of a man, a Roman general, who comes to Rabbi Akiva and says, Rabbi Akiva, let me ask you the following question. You believe that God created the world. You believe that God is perfect. And therefore, if you believe that God is perfect, then everything he creates is perfect. And more than that, you also believe that God, that God created man, that God created man. I can't get rid of it. Bigger gulps, still not helping. All right. That God created, hold on a second. That God creates man. Thank you. There we go. That's much, much better. That God created man in the image of God. And if you believe that God is perfect, and therefore man's image, man's body that's created in God's image is perfect as well, what right do you have to circumcise God's perfection? How would you take the body, which represents perfection, human, the famous statue of David in the Louvre, right? It was Michelangelo's attempt at expressing this Greek idea of external beauty, right? How do you have the right to go ahead and take what God created, a perfect being, and then circumcise it and cut it and make it something different, right? That was his question, a good question. And this is all part of Greek philosophy as well, that we value external things, that external beauty is perfection. So Rabbi Akiva says, hold on a second. He runs back into his house. He comes out with a stalk of wheat and a cake. And he says to the Roman, which one's better, the stalk of wheat or the cake? And the Roman says, the cake is better. So he says, why? He says, because it's edible, it's ready. He's like, but the cake was made by man and the stalk of wheat was made by God. You see, God created a world in which we're meant to go ahead and uncover its true nature. We're meant to work the world and remove the obstacles of the physical world to elevate into something bigger and more, right? That is the story of Hanukkah, and that is the story of Judaism. To be a Jew, it's funny because like Jewish comics have done this throughout history. Like Jews have, as comedians, the reason why they're so funny, because part of Jewish thinking and wisdom and knowledge is recognizing the absurd nature of the physical world and then revealing its absurdity. And then we laugh about it. That's why Jerry Seinfeld was so brilliant. He's making fun of like the simple things. But there's a lot of Jewish wisdom in that. Like the whole idea of Judaism is that Think beyond the material that we see. Life is not just about, living in big homes and driving fancy cars. It's not about having, making a lot of money and going on vacation. Okay, it's about us recognizing that the physical world itself is expressing a lie. We say it like this, and the Gemara says it so beautifully. He says, "Olam deshikra." This world is a world of lies. The word olam, world in Hebrew, right, has the same root as ne'elam, as hidden. The world itself is hiding a truth. What is that truth? Judaism says that the world itself is hiding God. It's hiding something else. This is a virtual reality experience, right? You are this massive being and you're made up of little small things. All big things are made from small things. The tallest mountains in the world are made of small little particles of sand, right? The sun, the most powerful, nuclear fusion power plant in our solar system, is made up of hydrogen, little dots of hydrogen colliding against each other. That's all it is, exploding in the sky. You are made up of tiny little cells that make you into what you are. But even behind the materialism that we see something even deeper and bigger. You are a neshama, and I can't measure a neshama. I can't measure your soul. I can't measure the spiritual world. I can't measure things like love. I can't measure things like commitment. I can't measure things like a effort. It's hard to measure those things. What does effort mean for you? What does it mean for me? But those are the values that we as Jews use to evaluate the meaningful lives that we want to live. So as God willing, next week, when we go through this, the next part of this conversation, I want you to be mindful of the following. We just said that Judaism, in order for a historical claim to be relevant, okay, and not to be legend, you need to have lots of people who saw this event, and then you have to have a group of people that watch this happen from generation to generation to generation. I want to show you something. I want to share my screen for a moment, okay? I just pulled this up on this website. I'll send you the link. I'll put the link in the actual chat box. Take a look at this later. This is going to blow your brains out. Okay, we talk about a chain of tradition that's been passed down from generation to generation. Okay, take a look at this. I'll put it up on my screen in a moment. Share screen. Those of you that are on YouTube, on Instagram, I'll post this in the chat a little bit later. Okay, watch this. This over here is a unbroken chain of Jewish tradition. Okay, we'll talk about going from Adam all the way to, you guys are on the way over here, all the way to the Chavetz Chaim or others, Rabbi Yisrael Salanter. We're talking about people, we know people today that were connected to these people. These were people that have a tradition going all the way back from rabbis. Like the last person who I know is on this chain over here is Rav Wolbe, who has a Masorah from Rav Chaim Shmulevitz, and who's connected to Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, and so on and so forth. There's been an unbroken chain of rabbis from the last 5,000 years of individuals that were passing a tradition from one generation to the next. Okay, but even if you have a hard time with Adam, Seth or Shet, Methuselah, Noah, these people, because it's so hard to relate to these long gaps of time. And even if you have a hard time believing in Abram, Isaac, and Jacob, the thing that we have to remember is this over here. Down over here, you have Mount Sinai that took place. All these things took place and no one denies it. We have large numbers of people that experienced it, large numbers of people that saw these events taking place, okay? And now you have a tradition, boom, Moses, Joshua, you have the prophetic era. We have all these amazing prophets and rabbis and educators who are passing, and we have written documentation, we have books that all verify this stuff as being true, being passed down from generation to generation to generation to generation. You find me another group of people, okay, that have it so mapped out so easily, right? We're so afraid of accepting all these things as being so true because they obligate us to become something bigger and more. The rabbi that put this together, this particular sheet, his name is Pinchas Winston. He was my neighbor. I lived with him in Israel. The guy's a genius. He spent years putting this together. Okay, it's it's beautiful to know that not only do we have a story in the Torah, all right, that says that this happened, but we also have a continuous line of Jews thinking, practicing, speaking about the same exact event that took place 2,700 years ago. Matan Torah reshaped the world. It forced our ancestors to never abandon their faith, because you can't make this stuff up. When you think more deeply, when you go beyond the surface, you find its truth, and it's so compelling, it obligates us. All right, so Bezrat Hashem, next week when we meet, we're going to continue the arguments. I'm going to do one more session on the unbroken chain of Jewish tradition. If anyone has any questions at any point, please feel free to send them over. Thank you so much for listening. Wishing you a Shavua Tov and a Shabbat Shalom.